In today's video, we're jumping back to our NHL offseason plan series. Today, we're looking at the 19th ranked team from the regular season, the Pittsburgh Penguins. What should we expect from them? They have lots of questions to be answered. We'll discuss the line coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, today we're taking a look at the offseason plan for the Pittsburgh Penguins after an unfortunate 22-23 season where we saw them miss the playoffs for the first time in a really long time. They already had some moves made at the end of the season, and now there's lots of questions surrounding this franchise and how do they move forward after, especially last year in the offseason, signing some of their key legacy players. Of course, Crosby's still under contract. How can this core group of veterans who have won many times before still get things done late in their careers? What kind of supporting cast do they need? We'll discuss all that. But of course, if you're new to this series, we're going to start with recapping their 22-23 season, take a look at some key team stats, moves that were made that were certainly worth discussing, take a look at their salary cap, where things are at, then we're going to look at their internal business on RFA and UFA contracts, who's expiring, so who needs to be re-signed or replaced, and then we'll examine the top questions facing the franchise. So let's recap last year. First 22-23 NHL season for Pittsburgh. Like I said, the first time in several years we saw the Penguins fall short of the Stanley Cup Playoffs to finish with a record of 40, 31, and 11 for 91 points. To be honest, this team had every opportunity to make the playoffs. It's their own doing why they did not make it. It's not like they didn't have every chance to wrap things up late in the season, but they blew a couple of must-win games against extremely weak opponents, including in the final one of the Chicago Blackhawks game. When they lost that game, they gave the opportunity to the Florida Panthers to get into the postseason instead of Pittsburgh. That ultimately changed the whole course of the direction of these playoffs. Look what Florida has done. As I record this video, they're in the Eastern Conference Final, 1-0 lead against the Carolina Hurricanes, whereas Pittsburgh would have played Boston. Maybe they win, maybe they don't win. Maybe the Bruins' historic season continues. It certainly altered history for sure, but that big game that they absolutely had every right to win. And the almost American Hockey League team, basically version of the Blackhawks, so they didn't have a lot of NHL really great quality players. They blew it. And it's just that simple. They really should have been in. They were pretty much what you'd call a mediocre team most of the year. They scored 262 goals, which was 16th best in the league. They allowed 264 goals against, which was 19th best. So certainly, a goal differential of -2. That's usually not going to see a negative goal differential in the playoffs. The power play was respectable, 21.7% for 14th best, so just above league average. The PK was 79.1%, just the right around league average at 16th best. So overall, special teams were okay, goals for were okay, but like I said, to me, this team this year kind of had their moments where they looked really disjointed and just not good, and there's other times where they look much better, but at the end, they kind of average out as being kind of mediocre. That's not a team that's going to be contending for a Stanley Cup. They ended up finishing 19th in the league. After the season ended, they fired President Brian Burke and GM Ron Hextall. Of course, near the trade deadline, they did make a few trades to try to load up to get into playoffs, including picking up forwards Mikhail Granlund and Nick Bonino. Not exactly huge moves. The Granlund moves was a major head-scratcher to me. I'm not really sure what Ron Hextall was thinking. He did not fit. He comes with term, an aging forward. Just complete head scratcher, in my opinion. No wonder those guys were let go. To me, they were not doing a good job. And it's just that simple. Looking at their salary cap situation, they have 15 contracts in place for next year. Totaling their cap hit is $63.29 million, leaving them with $20.2 million in salary cap available space. Of course, that's assuming we get a $1 million increase this offseason, which we're expecting for the cap to jump to 83.5. Of course, if there is, additional changes there, which are remotely possible, that number could possibly increase. So now let's take a look at, with that cap space, what they have for internal business to consider taking care of here. Let's look at their RFAs and UFAs heading into the offseason. The RFA list is pretty short and sweet. They have Ryan Poehling and Drew O'Connor. Both of those guys could be given qualifying offers and signed for fairly cheap. If they want to bring them back, it's not really a big deal. To me, they're not, super important core players, and they're not exactly guys you want to completely discard either. I think there's a possibility both are retained, But if they are, like I said, not a big deal, not going to be overly costly. The UFA side certainly has some interesting options, how much we can say for sure. Forward Jason Zucker, who's been there for a few years now, certainly, for the most part, is as a decent winger. Do they try to upgrade and bring in a higher scoring version of him? I'm not sure, but he obviously is looking for a new contract. According to his comments, would love to stay. We'll have to wait and see. Goaltender Tristan Jarry, of course, has been the starting netminder there for a few years as well. That's a big, important decision. Nick Bonino, who they acquired at the trade deadline. Denton Heinen, again, another player who's been there for a little while. Josh Archibald, defenseman Brian Dumoulin, who has been for a fairly big part of their decor for a long number of years. And Dmitry Kulikov, another recent acquisition there. So certainly lots of decisions. Among the UFAs, I'm honestly not sure that there's very many that would be brought back. I think there's a chance that they re-sign Zucker. Not a given, but I think it's possible that he can return on a new contract. I really think they needed probably a change in goal, but we're going to discuss that a little bit further and take a look at things. But there's a real chance that none of these guys return and we get a different supporting cast next season. So what are the top burning questions facing the Penguins going into the offseason? Well, to me, the biggest one is who is your next general manager, possibly even president. Of course, Mike Sullivan, the head coach, is still there. He has a long-term contract, seems to have a lot of power and pull with Fenway Sports Group, who are now own the franchise. He's obviously going to be involved in that search process to get this person hired. I think that they're going to want to make sure this person comes in as somebody who can work well with Sullivan. But Sullivan's certainly one of the more powerful head coaches around the league. I don't see him going anywhere for really any time soon. But whoever that GM is, that's a pretty important big decision because, for one, they're going to be making all these important decisions. So we're just over a month away from the NHL Draft, and then about 5 weeks or plus away from free agency. So they need time to really analyze this team and have some work to do here to have time to get that done. Of course, there is other support staff around that would have some prep work done for the draft and scouting and all that kind of stuff. But still, this person is going to set the vision and direction of this team. So obviously, whoever that person is going to help determine what some of these moves are. Some of the names that we've heard in the mix are Carolina assistant GM Eric Tulsky, Jason Carmanos, of course, familiar with the team as well, Jason Botterill, who was familiar with the team. Now, there has been some reports that Jason Botterill was more interested in a role as president more than GM. I don't know if that's going to happen, but he was in the mix. I don't know that he's necessarily going to be a front runner in this case. There's been some talk that John Chayka has been a discussion point there. Mark Bergevin, former Habs GM. So there's certainly lots of names out there that could very well be interesting. There's others too, but those are some of the most commonly mentioned names recently by NHL insiders like Elliot Friedman that they believe have interviewed and talked to the Penguins about this open position. So obviously, like I said, it's an important hire, and I don't think they're going to be taking too long to get this done. Recent reports indicate that they want to get something done fairly soon just because of the the urgency around decisions and business. The business that needs to be taken care of in the not too distant future. Obviously, once we know who that person is, we may have a better idea of what direction we're going to see this team go down. But one of the big decisions they're going to have to make is goaltending. That's a big question on this franchise. Who's your goaltending tandem next year? Casey DeSmith technically has a contract. He's probably back, but he really should be more of a backup, not a starter. I would think that there's a good chance Tristan Jarry doesn't return. He's been inconsistent and often injured. Had his moments as a really good goaltender. I'm not sure that, he's going to be done being a starter in this league. I think he could probably get work elsewhere. I just think the Penguins probably want something a little bit more stable back there. It's unfortunate, though, that after all the time and effort they put into drafting and developing this goaltender being part of the organization so long, that there's a pretty good likelihood he's going to walk via free agency and not have anything come back in return. But who that goaltender of the future that's going to take the reins on for the coming season, it's difficult to say. There's been some rumors they might be linked to Ducks goalie John Gibson, of course, is connected to the Penguins being from Pennsylvania. There's rumors that he would welcome a first start out of Anaheim to get a more of a chance to win during his prime years, because obviously he's getting into his later 20s now, has a decent contract. I mean, if you look at his numbers, they might not look the greatest, but you can make an argument that he's had a weak team in front of him for quite a while as well. So maybe a guy like Gibson comes in. There's been some speculation on goalie like Connor Hellebuyck or UC Saros, might be available this offseason. No guarantees, of course. But if any of those guys are on the open market for trade, I would suspect the new GM of the Penguins is going to look heavily into that and see what they can do, because ultimately there's not a lot of, at least nothing that's overly jumps out on the free agent market that could come in as a starting goaltender. There's lots of depth options out there for, second and third string goalies, but there's really not much jumping out and saying, hey, this guy's a free agent and he could be the next big starter. I don't see that as really looking through the UFA list as being a real possibility. So if they're going to get a new goalie, it's likely going to have to be via trade. Now, if that's not looking good, maybe they circle back to Jerry and sign him on a short-term deal if he wants to, but if he can get a longer-term deal elsewhere, then he's probably gone. Almost as their blue line's another big question as well. I do think they regret the Jeff Petrie trade. That Mike Matheson went out the door to bring Petrie in. Matheson, even though he missed a fair bit of time in Montreal being hurt this year, definitely a much better skater right now at this point in his career. He's really had a better season. Petrie did not do the greatest in his first year in Pittsburgh. So we'll see. I'm not sure what they do. I mean, guys like Dumoulin, Kulikov could, maybe be like, Dumoulin has been, for the most part, been a pretty solid defenseman. Another guy that's spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh, but he's been injured a lot through his career. Those injuries have certainly taken their toll. He's, I think it's fair to say, not quite the same player he was, 3, 4, 5 years ago, and wouldn't be shocking if they let him go and then they do some searching on the open market. We might see players like Pierre-Olivier Joseph again, Marcus Pettersson, have to take on bigger roles again and actually play more minutes. Letang, almost late, will be their number one on defense for some time. Will Ty Smith, who they acquired last year for John Marino, that's another trade that's not looking good. Marino really thrived in New Jersey, whereas Smith spent the bulk of the year in the minors. Another trade is the Jeff Carter trade back. Like, Ron Hextall really didn't do a good job in Pittsburgh at all, in my opinion. It was a really horrific run, and it's probably in their best interest that somebody else take the reins here, because these were a history of bad deals. But the blue line needs work. I mean, whether it's, Ty Smith coming up from the minors or going into free agency trains, they need to make some changes. There's absolutely no doubt they have to be able to defend better and break the puck up better. So we'll see what they do in that front. Can Alex Nylander be a full-time player for them next year? He's only on a cheap contract and a lot of recalls, especially late in the year. And actually, for the first time, looked to be pretty decent. I mean, he was a high pick, of course, by the Sabres. Brother William Nylander came in with a lot of fanfare, a lot of pedigree, and has never really worked out in the NHL. But this is the first time that he's had more of an opportunity, especially during his time in Pittsburgh, and actually looked pretty decent that time. So I think that there's a good chance that he could win a roster spot next year. Obviously, that will help them, because if he's going to be a player who can play and contribute on a cheap contract, that gives him much more wiggle room cap-wise as well. Will they be able to move on from any of these bad contracts? Like the Jeff Carter contract, not only did they bring him in, it was a mistake, but the contract extension was a worse mistake. And then they bring in Granlund as well, another mistake. Like, they have these older, slower forwards that are not being productive. This is not the way to go about things. You've got Crosby, Malkin, and Letang that still are playing at a high level, and this is the support you give them. I don't think this is what they really need to be successful. Then you have to wonder, if the window in Pittsburgh is closed, can they possibly put anything together here that is very well going to be a more successful roster? You have to really wonder. Goaltending, another option. I know that the odds are probably slim, but I do wonder about Marc-Andre Fleury in Minnesota. I know Fleury himself made comments at the end of the season that he doesn't want to move his family around again, and he does have another year of his contract there. Then he signed with the Wild, but the Wild certainly have to re-sign Philip Gustafsson, who had a big season, a big breakout year, and is going to be needing a big raise. They're on a really tight salary cap constraints, and they might need to shed some money. So I thought, well, maybe Fleury could be that guy, and they could find a cheaper backup for Gustafsson. But it doesn't sound like that's going to be an option. But if he did move, would he go to Pittsburgh? Would the Penguins want to bring him in for another kind of last dance type of approach like we've seen in Boston this year? Makes me wonder, but it doesn't sound like it's an overly realistic thing, but you gotta make you wonder. But there's lots of things, lots of questions. Who's going to be the GM? Can they remake the blue line a bit? Can they move out some older forwards that aren't producing, shake things up that way? There's going to be a lot of activity in Pittsburgh this year. I have no doubt about that. It's just a matter of what kind of move should we expect. It's hard to know without knowing who is going to lead this franchise. That's going to be a big question that we don't know. But I think some trades are definitely in order. Could it be Gibson? Could it be, another big-time forward? We'll have to wait and see. But something has to give here if they're going to try to get back into the playoffs, because there's going to be a lot of teams that they're going to have to try to jump ahead of that just, I'm not sure. It's not going to be an easy job. We'll see what happens. Let me know your thoughts on the Penguins and what moves we expect from them in the offseason down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.